What's good? It's Woog. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. Anderson, the Spider, Silva, 45 wins, 10 losses, 1 no contest. Damn. Anderson Silva has 10 losses now. Wow. Versus Uriah Hall, 15-9. So it sounds like this will really be the Spider, Anderson Silva's send-off retirement fight. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time listing all of the reasons why Silva is a top 3 fighter in MMA history, at least. Although you can't talk Anderson Silva without discussing at least some of his dominant reign over the middleweight division for nearly an entire decade. I mean, from 2006 to 2013, it was basically the Anderson Silva show. And the array of methods that he was using to destroy opponents showcased, seriously, some of the most scintillating images in combat history. I mean, he was doing things that we'd never seen before, and some things that I'll never forget watching. For instance, people had obviously caught leg kicks before, but when Silva went up to light heavyweight to fight the hard-hitting James Irvin threw a body kick in the first round. Silva caught the kick with one hand and then immediately drilled Irvin with his free hand, sending him to the canvas and finishing him within seconds. I'd never seen anything like it before. Just check out the fluidity of that finish. This was well ahead of its time. And those who might keep Silva out of their top 2 of all time, they might point to a lack of great opponents and just that the state of the middleweight division wasn't as developed as it is now. But to that, I would then argue that you had a lot of would-be champs who simply were stonewalled by the Spider's presence in the division. Legendary boxer and one-time Anderson Silva hopeful opponent Roy Jones Jr. did the same to the super middleweight division of boxing and the light heavyweight division during his long reign, where you had a whole bunch of, well, who's he fighting? Well, these guys and these names never build up because they keep hitting the wall that is Roy Jones Jr. Some of that applies to the middleweights that were victims of the Anderson Silva era. Even Dan Henderson made a serious run at light heavyweight, but his strongest path to the title was probably at middleweight. Dan Henderson had challenged Rampage Jackson after Rampage knocked out Chuck for the title. Dan Henderson came up short. He later goes to middleweight 185 and challenges Anderson Silva for the title, and Silva finishes Dan Henderson via submission choke. Now, Silva never made a sustained effort at light heavyweight. He was always true to the middleweight division. He would only occasionally pop up and fight James Irvin, or the second time, it was versus former light heavyweight champ Forrest Griffin, and Silva finished Forrest Griffin with a step-back counter, which was one of 3 Jedi-like strikes that resulted in knockdowns. You can't overstate the talent gap and the skill gap between the two. And there was, going into the fight, a lot of people who thought that Forrest Griffin's size and, success that he beat Rampage Jackson for the title, was going to give Anderson Silva some problems. And watching these two fight, just eyeball test, this was one of the biggest mismatches I can recall. It was shocking. Rewatch Anderson Silva versus Forrest Griffin. My goodness. And this was in an environment when when Bruce Buffer was announcing the names, you could totally tell, I believe it was a Philadelphia crowd, they were so in favor of the U.S. fighter Forrest Griffin, and they are booing Anderson Silva, and he's got his hands on his hips, and then I'm sure was expecting them to be a pro-Griffin crowd. I don't think he expected to the extent that they were going to boo him when his name was mentioned. So Buffer's saying, Anderson, the Spider, Silva, and there's just cascade of boos, and Silva's like looking up at the crowd like, and then he closes his eyes, takes a deep inhale, and then just goes back into focus mode and puts on one of the most memorable performances I can recall. Now, there were a few higher popularity peaks during the Silva era. There was Brock Lesnar, who at his height in Mania was more popular in terms of how big of a pay-per-view draw he was than Silva, no question. Even Rampage Jackson, I would argue, was more of a mainstream popular fighter than Anderson Silva. George St. Pierre was a more popular fighter, but with the exception of GSP, you couldn't argue any of these guys were on the level of skill and just mastery of mixed martial arts that Anderson Silva was. Yeah, I would say quality-wise, before the emergence of Jon Jones, only GSP was the guy, and maybe Fedor Emelianenko. We could have the broader discussion. But only one or two were even in the discussion of pound-for-pound status, all-time wise, with Silva. Silva was so dominant that people wondered how he would do against the light heavyweight elite, the Lyoto Machidas, Shogun Ruas, and later Jon Jones, even though the light heavyweight limit is 20 pounds higher than the middleweight limit. And Silva by this time was moving into his 40s. Silva wasn't finally dethroned by Chris Weidman until he was 38 years old, after having a 7-year run as the champion. That was 14 successful title defenses. So you capture the title, defended successfully 14 times. I mean, by contrast, and I'm not going to do the opponent by opponent comparison in this case, but Israel Adesanya is the current middleweight champion. He's defended it successfully now twice, versus Yoel Romero and versus Paulo Costa. Kamaru Usman has defended now against Colby Covington and against Jorge Masvidal. 2 defenses. Silva had 14 successful ones before finally losing the title via knockout to Chris Weidman. The guy's striking was just next level, and dimensionally, he had reach-wise some advantages that just made for some of the most dramatic videos in some of his stoppages. There's the iconic Vitor Belfort front kick finish, the pre-UFC standing reverse elbow knockout of Tony Strickland in Cage Rage. When Silva was finally severely tested by a trash-talking wrestler, Chael Sonnen, who took him down and kept him down 5 times in 5 rounds, Silva, with 90 seconds to go before losing the title in a 5-0 decision to Chael, pulled off a last-minute submission of a lifetime. From the guard position, he was getting roughed up for almost the entire 24 minutes that fight lasted. Chael Sonnen had 1 minute to go before finally someone not named Anderson Silva would be crowned middleweight champ. Silva hit Sonnen from the guard, which I believe cut Sonnen, and then it got Sonnen to drop his head into Silva's belly sternum area, and then Silva executed a beautiful fight-finishing triangle choke, causing Sonnen to tap. This was unbelievable stuff. And again, Silva did it in all types of ways, submitting Hendo, knocking Vitor out. By the time leading up until Silva finally losing, he was getting to this Jedi-like scenario where he would just sit in a crouch and then drop his hands and then let a Yushin Okami or a Stephan Bonner advance on him, and then just one strike at a time, pick them apart, dropping them and then finishing them. And let's not discount how Silva won the title. The way that he beat Rich Franklin with that another iconic fight with the Muay Thai clinch from hell. We had never seen somebody just caught in that vice grip the way that then champion Rich Franklin was. A total destruction. He also destroyed Rich Franklin in the rematch. I mean, this guy just took the game by storm. So let me then ask the question, can a fighter with such an elevated and esteemed status as an all-timer, can they and their ranking, their esteem, be impacted severely simply by hanging around the sport too long and for fighting too long, taking too many late career losses? Let me know what you think about that. That's another topic for another video. But from that first Chris Weidman fight on, Silva's looked like half of the devastating fighter he once was. Yes, he fought a very competitive fight and somewhat close fight at 44 years old versus the 29-year-old Israel Adesanya. And yes, he'd had that moment of violent brilliance at the end of the 3rd round in a decision loss versus Michael Bisping, where Silva even thought he'd won the fight, but the fight was allowed to continue. Very confusing moment, especially with the amount of celebrating that Silva was doing. He hopped up on the side of the cage, did his iconic, like, he did the whole thing. And the fight had to continue. He ended up losing by decision. But these were just the last flashes that, if anything, reminded us of the greatness that we were once treated to for several years. Anderson Silva is 1-6-1 in his last 8 fights. Yet he somehow managed to still take very little damage in these late-stage losses, except for his legs. compared to, say, a BJ Penn or a Wanderlei Silva, the guys who stick around too long, Chuck Liddell, and you just see so many instances of them sleeping on their back. In fact, that first fight versus Weidman is the only time we've seen Silva really get put out. But Silva's supposed final opponent, Uriah Hall, will probably want to make this as unceremonious and disappointing an exit for Silva as possible. Now, Uriah Hall came into MMA prominence through the Ultimate Fighter series in 2013 during that John Jones versus Chael Sonnen build-up. And Hall landed this spin kick knockout that made him one of the most exciting prospects in the sport. Kind of a Johnny Walker before Johnny Walker, but in terms of how much he captured the hardcore fight fans' imagination. Actually, Chael Sonnen, during one of those Ultimate Fighter episodes, was so enamored by Uriah Hall's abilities that he once told him that he could one day be UFC champion and the greatest middleweight to ever do it. Now, sometimes Sonnen will say things just to say things, and sometimes I wonder how much he means certain things that he says because he plays the game, so to speak. But he even emphasized the greatest to ever do it while gesturing to a poster of Anderson Silva on the wall. Now, whether it was Chael who was actually looking at the wall or just the editing of the show that glared towards the picture while Sonnen was talking to a then pretty green Uriah Hall, it was clear that Uriah Hall had a ton of potential. Well, Hall would go on to lose in that series finale versus then underdog Kelvin Gastelum, who nobody but Gastelum thought would amount to much of a UFC fighter. Gastelum's self-belief, in spite of the measurables and his low distinction at the time, they were evident then, and it's cool to see how he's turned that into a very good UFC career. I mean, he was fighting Israel Adesanya for an interim title and was actually slated to challenge Robert Whittaker for the official title before Whittaker had to pull out due to that intestinal illness. Uriah Hall, on the other hand, has had very mixed results, going a total of 8-7 since joining the UFC. And you get the feeling that he hasn't truly fulfilled some of those early projections, given his obvious potential and exciting fight finishing talent. His best wins came in a decision win versus top contender and former title challenger Thiago Santos in 2013, and then a knockout versus underrated middleweight great Gegard Mousasi, who's about to fight Douglas Lima in Bellator just a couple days prior to Hall versus Silva. Mousasi, by the way, would return the favor and knock Uriah Hall out in their rematch. Hall's most recent loss was 3 fights ago in a 2-round destruction at the hands of Paulo Costa, middleweight's most recent title challenger. Hall fought a spirited fight, but he ultimately had no sustained answer to Costa's constant pressure and power shots. And actually, Hall versus Costa should give you an even greater appreciation of Adesanya's technical and strategic brilliance. Because Costa, up until that fight with Adesanya, was looking like a destructive force, especially versus Uriah Hall. So Hall has some dynamic athletic talent, decent cardio, not great, but he also doesn't do a great job of making in-fight adjustments. Usually, if you can withstand his striking game in the first round, you should be in a pretty good position to outmaneuver him, especially if you have solid stand-up grappling and can kind of push the pace and, you know, sort of beat him at the tit for tat and be more consistent with your combination deployment whilst maintaining your defensive responsibilities, like looking out for Hall's occasional surprise home run attempts like a spinning back fist or an exotic head kick. Now, from a craft and timing standpoint, Anderson Silva in his prime was just in another galaxy compared to Hall. But this fight is taking place in 2020, and Uriah Hall should be able to beat a 45-year-old Silva, probably by decision. Silva is very tough to finish. He went up to light heavyweight and faced Cormier on short notice and lasted a 3-round decision loss. In fact, aside from his knockout loss to Weidman, where Weidman delivered one of the most historically significant singular strikes in MMA history, Silva's recent losses have either been via decision like the ones to Izzy, DC, and Bisping, or via fight-ending leg injury, like his most recent fight with Jared Cannonier, and obviously in his gruesome leg injury versus Chris Weidman in their rematch. But Silva's activity level has decreased in recent years, but it's not only reduced volume, it's reduced effectiveness, both in landing percentage and in his opponent's reactions when he does land. Opponents back in the day just couldn't handle it when he would land. You know, they would start backing up, they would start turtling up. Silva was a devastating striker. Now you can see a Derek Brunson go the distance with him. Michael Bisping, Nick Diaz go the distance with him. I mean, this is not the same Spider we're talking about. Silva is a counter striker at heart, and I think that Hall's athleticism, height, ability to stick with some basic single strikes without overcommitting or leaving himself exposed will reduce the opportunities to land a well-timed, devastating counter for Silva. Whether this fight turns out action-packed or boring really depends on how much Hall is willing to press the issue, but I do think that he could earn a decision win even while playing into Silva's proverbial chess match. I also expect Silva's activity to wane even more if they head into a 4th or 5th round. This is a 5-rounder, right? But I've got Uriah Hall via decision win, probably 4 rounds to 1 or 3 rounds to 2. But the 2 wild cards in this one are obviously, where is Anderson Silva physically, reflex-wise, and just having any sort of ability to compete at a high level at 45, 46 years old. And the other wild card is that Uriah Hall has never competed in a 5-round fight. He hasn't done it. So if we're going into championship rounds, who does that really favor? Yes, I expect Silva's activity to wane, but sometimes the training wheels fall off the bike and you're just on cruise control, and I think that Silva's instincts might still be superior to Uriah Hall's. So maybe that's the key that Silva could kind of hang his hat on here. Maybe the lack of 5-round experience for Uriah Hall provides Silva an opportunity. And Uriah Hall is 36 himself. He's on a 2-fight win streak, and he really needs this win versus the old legend in order to keep what might be one final run up the middleweight rankings alive. But let me know your thoughts on the matchup, and any thoughts that you might have on Anderson Silva's amazing career, good or bad. And where do you rank him among the all-time MMA greats? I'll certainly do a career retrospective video on the great Anderson Silva. So, how do you see this supposed final Anderson Silva fight versus Uriah Hall playing out? And do you think Uriah Hall will ever crack the division's top 5? Please leave your comments in the comments, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.